damned by faint praise. Let me first of all add my welcome to all of you, and particularly, and I will take you through stages of my introduction, but I particularly thank the many friends who are in this room, and especially on the tables at the front here, because they've been friends of Props for the Future and what we're trying to do since literally the beginning. If I think of Datuk Yusuf Sulaiman, who is way back when we sat down at a round table, Prime Ministerial round table, discussing science strategy in Malaysia, he said, I fully support what you are trying to do here, and that has been an enormous pillar of strength for us. If I may, I want to just remind you of the people at the table, but particularly I want to start with young Ahmad Tunji Abdullah, who has again come back to visit us today. And she's been, again, a constant support and champion. And she's recognized more than most people that forest and agriculture are not enemies, they're actually partners. And that the idea that we work with the oil palm industry, and we work with forestry to actually promote the integration of agriculture into what is a complex and natural environment that we live in Malaysia. Tunjin and her husband Tun Abdullah Badawi have been champions of that from the outset of our relationship across the future. I want to thank, as I mentioned, that of Dr. Muhammad Yusuf Sulaiman, because of this agency called MIGHT, and it's an interesting concept. It's the idea of industry and government working together and linking with the agencies in the country. And Malaysia has a lot of agencies, and if I may say, one of the challenges is to implement policy, because policies are there. And the idea of bringing together critical mass within a fast emerging economy in a progressive country is to actually put these connections together rather than duplicate and repeat work being done by the institutions. MIGHT is critical to that. I want to mention, on behalf of Dr. Sharif Haroon, who is of course the DG of Maudi, I want to mention Dr. Prof. Muhammad Noor, who is the Director of Research and Deputy DG, and somebody who actually understands again that we need to work with the national and with the international. And this engagement we have with Maudi is to say, what Props for the Future must do is not duplicate what Maudi does, but actually build on what Maudi has here to lead to an international collaboration. I think that's one of the areas that we work very closely with Maudi. I want to mention a relatively new friend of ours, Dr. Sharifa Mastura Syed Abdullah, who is the head of the Climate Research Institute, and therefore the two people on the corner here have really very much in common. And if this acts as a catalyst to bring together the Reading excellent reputation and history of work through the Walker Institute of long-term weather forecasting, agricultural and meteorological research at Reading, with the excellent work that UKM and Professor Dr. Sharifa is actually leading in climate science, these are really the purposes of this engagement that we'll have today and during the next few days. Now those are the friends that I wanted to introduce, but I also want to thank, and of course you'll see the effort that Patrick, who you just met, and Maria have put into organising this event. But it wouldn't be possible, and I want to make my thanks particularly to Hilda, Binti Hussein, and Soraya Abdullah, who you just met, because this has been an enormous team effort. And at the outset, I want to recognise the late nights, the early mornings, the long thinking, and the hard work in putting something like this together. Why is it so difficult? Because I'm afraid life is complex, and what we're going to see in the next few days is how are we going to manage complexity, and how are we going to do that without devaluing high quality science. So where we are in this building is an experiment in trying to manage complexity. Climate is a big place, and climate is actually a very complex place for us to work, but we also have to live here and we have to work here, and therefore I want to be able to see how we can explore the idea of research and strategy and life in general have to actually be addressed together, rather than the challenge of doing research in our own subject area and not actually seeing the big picture. Because if there's one example of a big picture, that is that we live in a hotter and increasingly hotter world in which the climate will determine almost everything else that we actually have to achieve. Let me try and put all of this in context, and even before that, presuming the slides will move on as soon as I start, but I want to just remind you why we're here, and that's for the people at the other end of this room, the majority of people in this room who are early career, and I'm puzzled by the term early career because it's up to 10 years since your PhD, and 10 years is a long time, but I think the idea that what you really have to deal with are challenges that are beyond science and beyond your own subject area. And I really think this week will be something which everybody who's an early career researcher in their subject should get exposed to, is the business of science, the business of funding, and the consequences of what you do as a scientist is greater than your own discipline. So I hope at the end of the week you'll feel that this week has been worthwhile in thinking about these broader issues. I'm going to start with this diagram, which I call the O'Reilly pyramid, because when I once asked Patrick, how do I explain this very complicated issue of biodiversity and the consequences of increased specialization on the world, he drew this diagram for me, and I now use it pretty much everywhere. And it explains lots of things, but let's just start with what does it explain in the first purpose of it. The pyramid represents global biodiversity, and of course you can see that green pyramid, by definition, is a sharp apex and a very broad base. And we could add anything we like to that, because the numbers are very, very unclear, but that could be 3 million to 30 million species on the planet, 10 million in the oceans. It could be 950,000 species of insects. It could be 400,000 species of beetle. I thought there were only 4 beetles, but there's 400,000 species of them. And it could be plant diversity, which is somewhere between 350,000 and 500,000 species of plants. And we're still counting. So why is that important? Because the world sits on the apex of that pyramid. And in the apex of that pyramid, if our always a technology problem on the first presentation, isn't it? Ravi, you might have to sit there and maybe just always turn it on. For most of our history, we've lived in close association with plants and the natural biodiversity of the planet, of which this country and this region is second only to the Amazon in terms of diversity. So as a genome, 3 million years of human history on the planet, that's been the normal situation. That's been and is our normal condition. About 200 years ago, we started mechanizing agriculture, and only about 10,000 years ago did we start farming. So in our 3 million years of history on the planet, we have almost a dot in our history in terms of what we call agriculture, what we call conventional agriculture, as monocrops of very few species. And if we look at the apex of the pyramid now, we depend on a tiny number of plant, and for that matter animal species, for our 7 billion people on the planet. In fact, this crop here, wheat, plus rice, plus maize, and plus soya, account for 75% of the world's food, 4 crops. And if we put them through animals, 90% of the world's food. Now, you just don't have to be a specialist to say this is a very significant factor. 350,000, 500,000 plant species and 4 account for most of the world's food. And if we add the few animal species together, less than a dozen are about 95% of the world's food. Is that the way we have to move for future agriculture? These are plants, of course they are, but they show the biodiversity not of systems, the monoculture of single species, but the diversity of species in that pyramid that we call food crops. And we variously call food crops between 7,000 and 30,000 plant species, still a lot of species. Yet, we come back to how many of those species are now major crops, even locally. And these are all local crops in Malaysia, but of those crops, the largest consumption of food in Malaysia is through this crop. directly or indirectly. We feed our fish on maize, we feed our chickens on maize, we feed ourselves on maize, we feed our engines increasingly on maize, and we look for more uses for maize. Great crop. Question is, at the pyramid apex, is it the only crop and is this the only species that we should now be looking at for future investment and progress? You see the clever logo there, I'll show it again, it gets redder. So the world is getting hotter, we know that. And we look at ideas. Anyone recognize this person?
Darwin.
Thank you. Charles Darwin. Of course, we know about theory, we know the theory of evolution. I think very few people disagree with it. But of course, what this illustrates is the power of ideas. The power that theory becomes accepted by scientific investigation. And the idea that these theories have to be tested empirically and increasingly against hard evidence, scientific evidence, and extrapolate. In other words, we can't just do theory in one place and expect the results to be consistent unless we have the power to extrapolate and take to different environments. This is what you might call a generalist. But if the last 200 years of science tell you anything, we've actually moved from this idea of ideas to this idea of technologies. And most of you will recognize what that is, but probably not particularly what species or genetic construct that is. But you can see the point. Technology now is the new black. I think you can take forward technology by more and more detail, more and more specialism. So the point I'm making as we go through these slides is we go from complexity, the world is complex, nature is complex, agriculture is complex, not to simplicity, but to specialism. We move to specialism. And specialism takes us to the top of the academic pyramid, career paths, promotion, recognition, peer-reviewed publications are in specialist areas. They're not in understanding the big picture, they're in understanding technical detail of more and more about less and less. Here's our hotter world, and there's complexity. Knowledge, vernacular, indigenous, traditional, call it what we like. There's a huge library of knowledge in that person's head. And the problem is when that person dies, the knowledge goes, because it's not recorded, it's not collated, it's not curated, it's not published. And once it's lost forever, because the genetic species of knowledge that this person has will still be in gene banks and botanical collections. The knowledge in that person's head will not be in gene banks and botanical collections. Again, this is why it's so important that our friends from TRCRC in Landscape Malaysia understand that knowledge is as important as this knowledge. And that knowledge now resides here, in technical information in laboratories. Now, I make all these points not because this is wrong, but I just make the point, historically, this is the direction we have moved over the last 200 years to greater and greater specialism and greater dedication to excellence in particularly narrow fields. There's a critical phrase sometimes used that so-and-so has mind as sharp as a razor and about as broad. And that's one of the risks, that we tend to think of science as something which is absolutely and only about specialism and not about context. Problem is, the world is getting more complex, and the challenges are getting more complex, and our future depends on how we address complex challenges rather than silver bullets, quick fixes, technical solutions. We tried technical solutions. The Green Revolution was about technical solutions. But actually, if we take the O'Reilly diagram again, the world in IPCC predictions is 3.5 degrees hotter by the end of this century, and our challenge is now going to be far more complex in how we address that. This is the agricultural supply chain in photographs, and it demonstrates what we're all familiar with. The growth, take seeds, we put them in the ground, we grow those crops, we harvest them, we make products from them, and then we consume them. There's the agricultural supply chain. Yes, it's changed in distance, yes, it's changed in complexity, but it's basically the same principle. People increasingly do not grow the crops they consume. So I want to take us now into the context of how, as an institution, Crops for the Future particularly is trying to address this matter. And that's why we call ourselves a research company, not a research centre, and not a university, not a criticism of universities, but if we actually looked at that in academic terms, we would look at that in terms of disciplines. And we look at major disciplines at the beginning: biotechnology, breeding, crop genetics, agronomy, physiology, post-harvest, product development, nutrition, of course, economics and markets. All of that, as our academic history has evolved, has led to disciplinary excellence, specialism, sub-disciplines, and sub-sub-disciplines, where you can be actually a recognized authority on the germination characteristics of one species. So here we have agricultural supply chain complexity, and what we've tried to do in Crops of the Future, very much a work in progress, is to map on the agricultural supply chain disciplines. The challenge is, how do we remain scientifically high quality and deliver high quality research in this chain, yet how do we address the issue of what is the purpose of our research at the end of the chain? And the chain is two ways. So we can have the market determining what we do in the field determining what are the plants that we're actually going to need for the market, and we have to break disciplinary silos if we're to make progress. So this experiment that Crops for the Future is about breaking the disciplinary silos but retaining the academic excellence. Not easy, but that's what we set ourselves as a challenge. So we call this blue integration across the gaps a research value chain. And it's the research value chain that I think will be of interest during this week, that you talk to colleagues from different disciplines and see how you can work together. And Mike illustrates this because we can't do all this alone. We have to do this with partners. So as is Mike, and we should also recognise the British Council in facilitating this meeting, Crops for the Future acts as a platform to bring in expertise and partners who are better than us at what they do, but help us in what we want to do, which is to get that boy at the end eating not carrots, but new and nutritious and marketable products from underutilized crops, as well as carrots. So that's our challenge, and we need partners, and we need allies, and we need support to deliver that, and therefore we don't pretend to be all things to all people. We have lots of partners around the world who help us deliver that value chain. Now the advertorial, so I shall ask, I just want to show you, before Ravi presses the button, I'm going to show you about a minute of video. It's to illustrate the building we're in is not what might just seem a nice place to work and live. We're trying to deliver, in other words, is it walk the walk or talk the talk or both? I'm not sure, but we have to deliver what we say in real life. So our buildings and our research has to mirror what we're telling other people to do. Underutilized crops have to have a purpose, and as you'll see, and I hope you'll have time in the next few days to walk around these buildings, if not our field centre as well, let me just give you a minute or so to give you a feeling of what this particular research facility here is all about. Keeping in mind, we now can't afford to keep research and operations separate. We have to bring research and operations. Felix has just walked in, so I'll illustrate this. Felix is head of our corporate services, and Professor Aitchin, so at the back, is a researcher, and they have to work together because as an organisation we don't have the luxury of operations over there, research over here, admin somewhere else, and the CEO going around the world talking to people. So this facility here has to illustrate that it brings together more than it separates. Ravi. It'll wake you up, it sounds quite loud as well. Okay, so why is that important? Because we are here trying to deliver energy efficiency as well, tell other people how to be efficient in the use of energy, because we're working in a hostile climate environment. The field centre is working to transition an oil palm plantation to alternative crops whilst working with the oil palm plantation as partners. Therefore, everything we do here has to actually be proof of concept on the ground, literally on the ground in some cases, certainly in our facility. I'll give you one example, which is the one I'll demonstrate because we're in this dome now. The Malay iconic structure, which many colleagues here will recognize, is based on a tudung saji. And the concept is that we build something that illustrates what we grow inside is a protection for plants, products of plants. But actually the structure is doing something much more than aesthetically pleasing and nice to live in and work in, I hope. It's actually reducing the energy. Of course we've got air conditioning on in our offices, but the actual temperature inside this building is 3.8 degrees cooler than outside. Why? Because we are using plants as part of our evaporation system on the roofs of our buildings, and of course, as you've seen already, in the core of our buildings. And these plants are unutilized crops, so they have to do a lot of work. They have to be useful, they have to be practical, and they have to be aesthetically pleasing. Collectively, they have to produce an answer to a global problem, because 3.8 degrees is about exactly what we predict is the climate change. When we say Paris 2-degree target, we're not going to make it. I can exclusively reveal that we're not going to make the 2-degree target. It's going to be 3.5 to 4 degrees hotter unless we make absolutely drastic changes to lifestyles. So we can put sums on that. There's our 3.8 degrees, and we can look at what causes, what's the combination of circumstances that makes the building 3.8 degrees cooler. Of course, evaporation, the bottom bit, convection. If you feel, and you will as you walk around the buildings, air is flowing through the building. There's a Venturi effect. And at the top, the louvers are reflecting radiation. Therefore, they're actually allowing less direct beam radiation in, but they're actually reflecting that, and they're allowing airflow and even light to come into the building. As a minimum, it must make people feel happier to work here. It should be aesthetically and practically what they might call a human comfort level should be greater than it would be if we stood in the field and did our research or worked in laboratories made of concrete and glass. So aesthetically, this place should be a place people feel happy to work. But it must, in this case, save money and hopefully make money, because the model that we may test here as an experiment should be something we could replicate throughout the humid tropics. There's only passive cooling. We haven't added anything other than structure to cause the air temperature to be 3.8 degrees cooler than outside. So let me bring together some of these principles, and why is this so relevant to Malaysia? I've mentioned already Malaysia is the home, the second largest repository of terrestrial biodiversity on the planet. 5% of the world's terrestrial biodiversity is in Malaysia. Its oceans are the richest source of marine biodiversity on the planet. So Malaysia has a particular relationship with the bottom of that pyramid. And instead of seeing plants and conservation as a burden, we must protect these species and look after them, we should see them as an opportunity, because this literally is a God-given opportunity for Malaysia. That biodiversity, based in the UK as I have spent all my career, there's no biodiversity. We can't conserve something we don't have. There's literally no biodiversity left. Here we have this biodiversity. How do we address the challenge of that thing at the top, the hotter planet? We've got to look at biodiversity as our first place of comparative advantage and see that as an opportunity. And I want to show the other reason why the last few weeks have been so important for Malaysia. These two clips I want to show, one is a short video, the other is a photograph. Both took place between 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock on the 7th of December 2015, and they both took place at the COP21 UNFCCC Climate Change COP21 agreement was signed. As you all know, the Paris Agreement said we will work to maintain a target of 2 degrees, significantly below 2 degrees, it actually says, above pre-industrial revolution levels. That's the target 187 countries signed. And 12 weeks earlier, those and other countries signed the United Nations Sustainable Development Agenda, in which they committed 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 169 targets to the world. The top target is no poverty by 2030, anywhere. So we now have no poverty by 2030 as our challenge. And that's a global commitment. And this is how much significance that was, because Tuan Wanjanati Tunku Jaffa, the Minister for Natural Resources and Environment, spoke on the floor of the United Nations alongside Tuan Abdullah Badawi and Tun Jin, who's here, and this is what he said as a global commitment that Malaysia made on the 7th of December to the world.
Here we reaffirm our commitment to maintain at least 50% level of forest tree cover in perpetuity through zero net deforestation and degradation, thus halting net forest losses by deforestation and stopping net decline in forest quality. This would be achieved by reforestation and enrichment of degraded land to increase carbon sequestration and mitigate climate change effect.
So if you take that word by word, that is an enormous commitment that Malaysia has made to the world. Zero net deforestation and reclamation of degraded lands for carbon sequestration. And that is the challenge that we face now, is how to deliver that commitment and to do that with the advantages we have in this room and in this country. 2 hours later, you can see Tun Jean Abdullah in the background, you can see 5th Prime Minister of Malaysia, Tun Abdullah Badawi, being the founding signatory of the Declaration on Agricultural Diversification. And that said, led by Malaysia, that we will address the Sustainable Development Agenda goals, 6 of them, energy, food, life on land, etc., climate action, through the diversification of agriculture to work with the natural environment rather than against it. And that signatory was in front of 50 international science leaders and researchers, and we hope many more signatories over the next few weeks, because the declaration will lead to this global action plan for agricultural diversification, which will be launched in Mexico this year at the COP13. I don't want to go on too long about this, but COP13 Convention on Biological Diversity, for the first time since 1992, includes agriculture. Agriculture was never part of biodiversity until this year, and now agricultural diversification will be the first agenda item on the CBD 13, so we must deliver that global action plan. So in conclusion, everything that in my career has led to greater specialism and greater competences in very narrow fields of science is by itself not enough. We mustn't devalue science, but we must understand that science is a means to which we address complex issues, and there's nothing more complex than how we're going to achieve the Sustainable Development Agenda and the climate change COP21, COP22 this year commitments. And in Malaysia, we have the natural resources, including the agricultural species. We don't yet have a Charles Darwin, but I'm sure there's one in this room. And we have indigenous knowledge that we lose at our peril. Collectively, those ideas and that strength is something which I hope your generation, because you are literally the crop of the future, and yours is the task to actually deliver technical excellence and science in a more complex and more volatile and more vulnerable world.